emerge from a particular medium or a process, right? So I'll start with medium. The inherent properties of a medium, it's the visual properties that naturally emerge out of that medium. For example, you might look at this and you say, oh, that looks like an oil painting, right? So they're the visual properties that make the medium look the way it does. And that could change for example, a watercolor painting would have like that sense of color diffusing into into kind of wet paper. Inherent properties actually also emerge from a process, right? And by that, I mean the way in which something is made has a huge effect on the way it looks, right? So for example, two artists might depict the same scene in totally different ways. So if you had two artists, for example, drawing the same image, you might get something like this, which is obviously interesting but not desirable. And when we're talking about processes, we're getting into this really weird gray area where we're discussing things like style, technique, composition, and artistic intention. These are kind of like weird things to define. So what are the inherent properties of 3D computer graphics? Well, first off, computer graphics is actually made by a lot of people, okay? So the first film, here you're seeing a picture of 400 people. The first film actually had 800 people working on it. So we're talking about a lot of people that you have to coordinate together and get them working to create this final cohesive output, right? And when we're talking in computer graphics about a process, what we're really describing is a pipeline. And I'll really quickly go over what a pipeline means. And a pipeline means just all the steps that goes into making a 3D animated film. So I'll start with concept art, and I'll show you some really cool examples of the concept art from Spiderverse. So this was like some of the early concept art from India World. And you can see we're really leaning into like line work, misprinted kind of like colors. And the reason we're misprinting colors is because this particular world was based on Intrajal comics, which is Indian comic books from the 1970s. Yeah, you see how important all those inking line work is as well. The next world we visited is this world, which is Miguel's world, Earth 928. This world is really based on Sid Mead's drawings and John Berkey's work. So we're really leaning into a clean visual style with sharp, cool colors, blue pencil sketches, rough markers, and acrylic paint. And this is some of the concept art that was created by the art department, which is really beautiful. These breakdowns were particularly helpful for us because they showed us what goes into making up these images, right? Starting from pencils and then building up the image in layers, which we tried to follow on the film. So we're kind of like true to that look. Gwen's world, which was really influenced by the comic book covers of Jason Latour. So here you can see we're really leaning into the watercolor. And finally, we've got Earth 42, which is the comic book, which was really inspired by the comic book art of Sean Gordon Murphy. This world was really dark. This is probably my favorite world in the film because it's really dark and it's super stylized. And again, you can see how important the inking layer is in this world, right? Getting those really dark lines. And there's even like some splatters in this world as well, where the artist kind of like splattered some ink on the paper, which is something that Sean Gordon Murphy did in his work as well. And finally, we've got Spiderpunk's world, which was inspired by 1980s rock punk posters. So once we have our concept art, we get into the production stage and everything starts with modeling. So these are some examples of the models that we created on the film. And then the important thing to say here about these models is they're created in a virtual world, right? We're kind of like emulating the real world, and we're kind of artists working in that world, pulling vertices, pulling kind of like the object apart and making a virtual model. Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Oh. Okay, here we go, back. Okay, so once we have our models, that then goes into the texturing and look dev department. And the texturing department basically just then paints all over those models to create our textures. And then look dev department creates shaders that basically react to light in the correct way. So here you can see some of the early tests of some of the objects that we created. And you can see how they're really trying to lean into that idea of creating those brush strokes baked even within the texture. This is a weird image. Sorry, I couldn't find an example of once we go into rigging. Rigging is basically where we set up our models so that they can be manipulated by the animators so they can create our performances. So this is an example of some of the controls that the animators would have on the rigs to kind of like move the model around. So essentially what rigging does is it creates a virtual puppet for the animators to move the model around. And this is a really fun first test of spot. So this is kind of something that you wouldn't have seen in the film. So this is where basically an exploration by the animators to try and figure out what is this character Spot, how does he move, what are his powers. This is really cool. That's fun, right? And then the next one is an exploration for Spot's face. And this is something that we didn't use in the film, but basically here's an early test where we tried to kind of like play around with how much expression is in that face. We ended up going with something much more simple, which was just kind of like a basic, kind of like more basic hole. But I think the reason they went away from this is because it felt maybe a little bit too zany. And personally, I'm really happy that they didn't do this because it would have been very difficult on a technical level to achieve, but it's really fun. All right. Okay, Spot, speaking of Spot, he was actually based on the work of Egon Schiele, who was an artist. His body proportions, the way he moves, he's kind of like, his overall shaping was based off this guy, which is kind of like an interesting tidbit. So once we have all our animation, all our models, and all our kind of like our textures together, what we do then is we take that to the lighting department, and lighting basically sets up virtual lights to light the environment, and then it goes into rendering. And what essentially the rendering software does is it simulates the scattering of light, right? Because that's what kind of like, for a long time in CG now, that's been our kind of holy grail, to make our renders look realistic. And we might get a render like this. So this is the final, this is an example of a final render, but in comp, we do a lot of work on this film. So in comp, we do much more work than a standard kind of like CG animated film. And you can really see here how much of a difference going from a 3D render, which would look like that, to a comp, how much work goes into that, into creating the final look. So I wanted to kind of like pose the question, what best describes these steps, all these steps that I've just described, right? Especially the steps in the middle, not the first and last step. But those steps in the middle, I would argue, are the emulation of objective reality. And what we're actually doing is we're creating a 3D world that mimics very closely the world that we're kind of like living in. We're adding cameras, we're placing characters, we're moving models around with a virtual puppet, and we even simulate the scattering of light. I mean, you can't get much more mathematical and kind of like real than that. And there's a really good reason why we do this, right? And the reason why we do it is because objective reality is a very convenient language to use when you've got so many artists trying to work together. A modeler can pass off a model, and then that model can be painted on, and then that model goes down the pipeline, and everyone really understands kind of like what that is, because pretty much we all experience reality in pretty much the same way. So what are the inherent properties of computer graphics? I would sum them up as this, right? And let's put these two images side by side, and we'll be going back to this. I would say 3D on the 3D side, it's made by a team. It's grounded in realism, so it's created in 3D, like we've just seen. It's precise and mathematical, and it's a very information-rich medium, right? So how does that compare to 2D art, right? Because we want to make our 3D look like 2D, so how does that compare? And this is where we run into a bit of problems, right? Because the two are totally different. With 2D art, 2D art is generally made by an individual, right? It's artistic intention is generally favored over realism, right? It's created in 2D. It's medium dependent, meaning that the particular medium that the artist uses has a huge effect on the output of the look of the still image. And it's an information poor medium, meaning that there's no time, there's no music, and I'll talk more about that in a second. So what we're essentially doing on Spiderverse is we're trying to play down all this stuff on the left-hand side, which makes it look 3D, and we're trying to play up all that stuff on the right-hand side, which try and make our work look more 2D. And ultimately, what we're trying to find is a balance between. We don't want to go all the way to one extreme or all the way to the other. We're trying to find something that sits in between, and that's where the Spiderverse film really fits in the in-between of 3D and 2D. So I'll show you an example of that. A really perfect example is our use of this software called Rebel. If you haven't used Rebel before, you don't know what that is, it's basically like Photoshop. And what it does is it really leans into the idea of emulating natural media. And when the developers talk about this software, they talk about the philosophy behind the tool is that they explain they want to capture that sense of childlike play that you experience when you're playing around with paint or any kind of natural media. So it basically looks like Photoshop, and you can, this is an example of how to use Rebel. You can just kind of like paint with it, and you can, but the really amazing thing about it is that its Watercolor Solver is incredible, right? It's very fast, and you can see here how it's very convincing, the way that it makes the paint drip across a piece of paper. And you can do really cool things with it, like you can say wet the paper first, and then you can paint on top of the wet paper, and the paint will diffuse into the paper like correctly, which I'll show you in a second. But there's a big problem here, right? This is like a 2D painting application that's not supported for animation. So how did we end up using it? Well, we came up with this kind of interesting idea where we said to ourselves, why don't we create curves in 3D, right? And those curves can then be used as data to drive the 2D painting application. So here's an example of that, right? See those curves popping on the left-hand side? That's passed off as kind of like data that gets transferred to the 2D painting application to drive the software. So we're essentially trying to kind of like think of a way of using this software for animation. And that's the idea we came up with. And these are some of the early tests that we did for that. So you can see here that some examples of the Watercolor Solver is really quite amazing. These are some early tests, and we use this technology quite a lot for Gwen's world, right? For all these shots where Gwen is kind of like in that environment where we go that really stylized world of Gwen's world, we put a lot of those Rebel simulations on cards and we stack them in space. And it was also used extensively in that third act where Spot goes crazy and turns into kind of like this villainous Spot. And we used all these Rebel simulations to kind of really give that unique look to kind of like his character. So that was just one tool that we used. The other one we used was a brushing tool that was inside of Nuke. So it basically allowed artists to create like a brush stroke look onto their comp very quickly. And you can see that here. And these are some early tests of using that tool, trying to figure out how we're going to combine that with 3D. So this is an example of how we built up an image going from sketch to fully painted. And this is another example here. And the cool thing about this test is it actually shows that deconstruction that I was describing before, where you can see how the objects really close to us are fully like rendered in that they've got paint on top of them, but the further back we go, we turn into kind of like a sketchy drawing. So it's like deconstructing the image. And all these tools really help to kind of like give our renders and our comps, take them away from that really obvious 3D realistic rendered look and make them feel more hand created. The other really important part about our tool set was line work. So line work, like I mentioned before, particularly in India world, was huge. So the reason line work is such an important part of the show is because it hits all those properties that I described that are really important 2D properties, right? It's made by an individual, it has artistic intention, it's created in 2D, and it's medium dependent in that it's ink on paper. And I actually developed a lot of the Linework tools on the show. And as I was doing it, I was reading a lot of art theory, especially about drawing. And this book is a really excellent one. If anyone here is interested in drawing, I highly recommend reading this book. And there's this one line in this book that particularly struck a chord with me, right? Yeah, and it's this line here where Harold says, "There is a more direct appeal to the imagination in drawing than possibly anything else in pictorial art." And what Harold is basically saying here is that drawing appeals to our imagination more than any other type of art. And he goes on to give two examples of two very distinct drawing styles. One of them is the one on the left-hand side, which is, he says, is very expressive, and is based more on how we feel objects rather than how we see them, right? This is kind of like, you can think of this as more kind of like the childlike, very expressive mode of drawing. The other mode he talks about is mode B, which is very optical. It's based on how we see things, like the light and shadow, and how artists draw with the optical kind of like the way they're seeing. The point that he goes on to make is that really good art combines both of these modes, right? We get the really optical mode, but we also get an expressive mode that's linked to our imagination. And he points to an artist named William Blake as a good example of an artist that did combine both in art history, right? And this is some of the work by William Blake, if you're not familiar. Actually, right now at Getty, there's an exhibition for William Blake, if you're interested. But he points to this artist and says this guy really has that optical mode as well as that kind of like expressive mode that's linked to imagination. And he says that if you need both, because if you go too much on the expressive, our art loses the link to our imagination, and it feels very, very, if you go too much to the expressive, our drawings are no longer linked to reality. But if you go too much to the realistic, they no longer feel imaginative and interesting. So he is saying that you need both of those modes. And I was thinking, in computer graphics, we get mode B for free, right? Because mode B is that computer-generated, very realistic mode. So what we do on Spiderverse is we introduce that mode A by creating drawings on top of our renders. And that really pulls our imagery away from this kind of like super realistic mode into a much more imaginative mode where we're kind of like engaging the viewer's imagination. So I'll show you some of the kind of like tools that we use to create those drawings. So this is from the first film, if you kind of remember that. This is an example of some of the drawings that we did on top of the character's face. This kind of stuff is deceptively difficult to do because you can stick drawings onto a 3D object just fine, but as soon as a character moves, you need to adjust those drawings. And adjusting drawings on the fly on an animated piece of geometry is actually quite tricky. So we needed to create these, we basically created two sets of tools. One set of tool was very kind of like direct, where the artist would manipulate the drawings by hand, which is this tool here. I actually named this tool Super Draw as a joke, and from that moment onwards, it was always stuck as Super Draw because I was trying to think of the dumbest names, but unfortunately, it stuck. So this is Super Draw. I think I even called it Super Draw 2000s to make it even dumber. And the cool thing about this drawing tool is that we use machine learning to try to train it. So basically what we're doing here is we're saying, based on the camera angle, this is what the drawing should be, and the machine learning algorithm will basically learn that pattern and be able to predict what the drawings would look like. And this crazy, sorry, it's a little bit nuts here, but this is an example of what those drawings would look like from all the different angles and the predictions that are made. Okay, the second tool we use is a much more procedural one, and by procedural I mean that it's rule-based. It's not something that's done by hand. And the reason that we need a procedural approach is because we had a lot of drawings to do. That hand mode was really useful for character spaces when you want to be really precise, because the character space is very precise and you need that kind of level of detail. But when you're doing environments, you need something that's procedural. And this is an example of that procedural tool. So you can see here, artists dial sliders, and they can basically create very, very different types of drawings based on those sliders. They can make it sketchy or loose, and most importantly, they can offset from the surface, which is actually something that's really tricky to do if you're doing just these drawings in comp. So as you might have noticed, the drawings are actually done from this camera space, but if you turn the camera, there's a problem, right? The drawings don't look good anymore. So you have to figure out how to make those drawings look good no matter what camera angle you're using. And the way we did that is we came up with a tool to figure out how much motion, how much does the object change in camera space, and that means we have to adjust those drawings. And the way we adjust those drawings, we draw them on and off. So drawings are constantly being drawn on and off as the characters are performing. And that wasn't actually a problem. It actually ended up being a really cool feature, because what you get is you get this really cool kind of like keep alive effect where the drawing feels like it's kind of like its own kind of like character, and it's constantly adapting and changing and redrawing. If the drawing was just static, it just wouldn't look as interesting. So it wasn't actually a problem. It actually turned out to be a really good thing. And these are some of the examples of the drawings that we had in the film. So I just wiped between the final render and the drawing passes. So you can see some of these environments are really massive. So there's no way an artist could be able to draw on that by hand, which is why we had the procedural tool. And these are the Linework passes. This shot actually was particularly tricky, right? Because of how much camera movement there is in this environment. So you can see trying to do this kind of environment, trying to draw it by hand would be an absolute nightmare. Okay, but the best part of the best method is actually to combine both of these tools. So we combined a hand-drawn pass, which is this here on this character Vulture, and we combined it with the procedural. So there's the two things combined that really gave us the best results. Okay, that's the end of part one. How was that? Ooh. Yeah? that's a lot of information, right? I hope the kids aren't too bored. All right, so in this second part, I'm going to talk about this concept of information gaps, where it gets a little bit more into the art theory. But I think this idea of information gaps is a really cool one, because what I'm basically trying to do is I'm trying to show you the link between reducing information and what effect that has on increasing your imagination, how much you imagine, and therefore how imaginative you think the image you're looking at is. Okay, you ready? This is the big one, and then after this one, we'll go into part 3, which is more kind of like much more easier to digest. All right, so part 2. So we're talking about information-rich mediums and how the information, 3D is very information-rich, right? And 2D is very information poor. So if you haven't seen this kind of TED Talk by Andrew Stanton, I highly recommend it. He talks about this theory called what he calls the unified theory of 2 + 2. And basically what he's saying is he doesn't, when he's writing a film, he worked for Pixar, by the way. When he's writing a film, he doesn't want to give the audience everything. He gives them 2 + 2 and lets the audience figure out 4. You don't want to spoon feed the audience, right? You don't want to give them 4. He goes on to say that the audience wants to work for their meal. They just don't want to know that they're doing it. And I was thinking about this when I was watching it. I was thinking this idea of reducing information in order to increase our audience engagement is something that you can apply to a lot of areas in art, right? So one of them would be like this, for example, in visual design, right? It's something that artists have, this idea is something that artists have been doing for a really long time, but they've been doing it intuitively. They reduce the amount of information in a piece. What the artist chooses to include or exclude not only speaks to their style, but most importantly, it creates space. It creates space for the viewer to fill in that missing detail from yourself, right? So when we look at something that has less visual information in it, we're personalizing that experience. And that idea of kind of like creating gaps of information actually applies to a lot of different areas. If you look at an impressionist painting, for example, you look at the individual brushstrokes and they're crazy messy, they're crazy crude, but our brains are really, really good at filling in those gaps. So you look at something that's a really crude painting and our brains automatically just fill in those gaps. And you might be surprised by like where this kind of like idea of reducing information, how far it goes within the context of art history, right? So for example, Diego Velázquez, you might be surprised to know here that this painting the colors in this painting are derived from 4 primaries, from these 4 colors, right? But looking at that, you might not know it, but your brain is automatically just accepting that and filling in the any kind of like gaps of information that might exist in that. So how does this apply to Spiderverse? Well, this idea of simplifying really started right from modeling, right? We simplify our geometry way more than any other CG film might, right? This gives you an example of how simple our geometry was. On a regular CG animated film, which I've also been involved in many, the objects in the environment would have much more detail than this, but on Spiderverse, we really simplified our geometry, but simplification really happened most in comp. So for example, this is what a lighting pass might look like, and this is what the end result would be. So see how simplified and graphic that is. And some more examples. So here, all the lighting decisions and color balancing is really made to enhance clarity and simplify the image. This is another example. So you can see how extreme we've gone in blasting away all that unnecessary detail. And it's amazing how much you don't miss it, because your brain is just filling in all that missing information automatically. It actually comes back to this a really interesting quote that I discovered the other day, where perfection is finally obtained not when there is no longer anything to add, but when there's no longer anything to take away, which I think is a really great way to sum up that idea. And the really important part to say about this process is that it's not random. It's very, very artistically decided upon by the art director and the production designer. So this is an example of a concept art that was created for us. They're being very selective about where to draw your eye, where to drop out detail, where to increase contrast. Okay, let's play a little game here. All right, this is a little game. This is a little thought experiment, and we're going to compare film with still art. Okay, because remember, they're the things we're trying to match. We're trying to match essentially 3D animated film to still art. And I'm gonna make some pretty broad generalizations here, so stay with me. But let's say that we have film, right? And we have this line that represents less information on the left-hand side, more information on the right. Where would you say film belongs on this line? And I'll give you a second to think about it. More, definitely, right? And on this side, we're going to say less at the bottom and more imagination on the top. I would place film on the right because film has 24 frames per second. It has dialogue, it has sound, it has music. So I would place it here, right? And let's compare it to still art. Where would you place still art? I would place it on the exact opposite end, because still art has much less information, and that lack of information really engages your imagination. You see, still art is a snapshot in time. There's no music, there's no sound, there's no dialogue. That stillness is pulling you in. You're trying to figure out what happened the moment before, what's going to happen in the next moment. And this is one of my favorite artists at the moment. But this also applies to photography as well. As Mark Cohen, a really good photographer. Our brain is trying to make sense of what's going on in this picture. We're more engaged. We end up using our imagination to try and make sense of the still image. So going back to our chart, I would say that if that camera icon down the bottom represents live action film, right? Where would you say traditional CG animation belongs on this chart? I would put it about here, because CG animation does definitely pull back on detail and therefore increases our imagination. But based on everything that you've seen so far on Spiderverse, just visually, what we do is we pull back way less information, and therefore we engage your imagination even more. So I think that's part of the reason why we've gotten the response from the audience that we have about our films feeling more imaginative. But Spiderverse, so far we've been talking about pulling back information visually, right? But Spiderverse doesn't just pull back information visually, it also pulls back information in time. And what do I mean by that? And I swear this is the last kind of like crazy concept before we move on, but the way that it pulls back information in time is, let's say films play back at 24 frames per second, right? So you can think of this as 24 unique units of information per second. So what Spiderverse does is, because it's often animated on 2s or 3s or 4s, we're holding frames. So in the end, we actually stream less frames to your eyes, and your brain is interpolating those frames automatically. So therefore, that's one way we're kind of like, we're introducing information loss on a technical level, but we're also introducing information loss on the way that the film is animated, because good acting limits movement, right? There's a whole history of this in performance. Limiting performance is a deliberate strategy in acting. By reducing movements, we draw attention to other aspects of the performance, such as facial expression, vocal delivery, or dialogue. By staying relatively still, an actor can make these other elements more prominent. And I'll show you some examples in the film. So this is a really good one, right? Where Gwen has just told her dad some really important information, and he's processing that information. So he's having this whole internal kind of like dialogue to try and figure out how does he feel about it. And the animators have been deliberately ambiguous about trying to kind of like tell us how is he feeling about that. And that deliberate ambiguity creates clues for the audience that imply what the character might be thinking or feeling. And that really draws us in, right? Because we're trying to figure out, what is he thinking? What is he feeling? How is he going to respond to this really big information? And this is another example in the film where we're maintaining tension by keeping the character relatively still. And in this scene, which is really beautiful, Miles's mom is kind of getting Miles ready for the world, getting him ready to send him off. And his only movement comes from his mom kind of like correcting him. So finally, what's the big picture we can take away from all of this? What's the final kind of like analysis? And I would probably sum it up as this, that the audience is the co-creator of meaning in the artistic experience, right? And the reason for that is because when we're looking at something, we're bringing in our own personal biases, our own personal points of view based on our own history. We're constantly trying to predict, and we're shaping what we're seeing with our own minds, right? And I would actually go one step further and say that we are the co-creators of meaning for any experience. But I think that's probably a different talk. But if you're interested in reading about that, I recommend this book, which actually gave me a lot of ideas for this topic. And in this, there's a really good kind of quote in this where the author says, "We can no more experience the world prediction and expectation free than we can surf without a wave." All right, that's the end of part 2, information gaps. All right, that was a lot. You guys okay? Yeah. All right. Okay, so the final part is part 3, where it's going to be much more personal now. I'm going to be talking about my own personal work and my own personal growth as an artist. My background is actually fine art, so I come from a kind of very traditional kind of like background. I've been working in CG for about 20 years in animated film, and these Spiderverse films have really triggered kind of like my love for art. And I've had a lot of thoughts. I've created a lot of experiments along the way, and as kind of my own personal kind of like project. And I'll share with you some of these experiments now. I've learned a ton doing these, and a lot of these experiments really tie in heavily with the stuff that we've already talked about. So going back to our slide for one final last time, the work that I'm about to show you, what it really ties into a lot is the medium dependent stuff and the artistic intention stuff. And that's really going to bring us to our conclusion of the talk, okay? And basically to try and get away from the grounded in realism and get away from the precise and mathematical that we very easily get, which is the natural process of 3D, okay? So, but before I show you some of my work, I wanted to kind of like caveat it with a lot of this stuff is very, very mad science, right? I haven't even like, it breaks a lot of animation, and I'm not pretending to have all the answers here. This is a very challenging problem. And having said that, let's start looking at some real painting. Okay, so these are some real paintings based on my home country of Australia. This guy named Arthur Streeton. I absolutely love the medium of painting, right? Especially oil. There is a natural beauty and complexity to oil painting that I've been trying to capture in CG, and I'll show you what my experiments in that in a second. So this is Arthur Streeton. He's considered one of the best Australian Impressionist artists, right? I also love, like, we're getting onto symbolism now, right? Getting away from Impressionism, but I really like Paul Gauguin as well. This is another piece by him. But I also love abstract expressionism. This is Joan Mitchell. It's some really beautiful piece. And then I really love this piece as well. Does anyone know who this one is? Any guesses out there? This one's actually my one. So this one is my attempt at trying to get something that looks organic and natural and feels more like painting, right? So these are some more examples of that. The way that I created these ones is I start off with very basic shapes, and then I create brush strokes, and then those brush strokes get rendered. But the biggest lesson that I learned in this personal kind of journey is the importance of color mixing. When artists paint colors, they usually mix them on a palette, right? These colors are often mixed is a mixture of smaller subselection of primary colors. And whether or not we're aware of it, when we look at painting, what we're looking at a lot is the result of color mixing. That's something that's just baked into the cake of painting, right? Color mixing. So color mixing in CG, unfortunately, is a very difficult problem. Like, say we have these two colors. What should the color? Green, right? But if you combine these colors in CG, what do you get? Something like gray, which absolutely makes no sense. And if you don't believe me, check out Photoshop. Put some blue, put some yellow, and blend them together, and you'll see some sort of weird combination of gray. So I knew that to try and figure that out would be like my first kind of like challenge. So we should be getting green. So I figured one of the things you can do to fix this is you can convert your colors into spectrum curves, which is basically just like a light wave representation of a color. And then by combining those curves, you combine those spectrum curves, and then you convert back to a kind of like regular color, and you get a much better approximation of pigment space color mixing. So I started off with something like this, which is just a teapot, right? And I started experimenting with creating those brush strokes that I showed you previously. And I was getting stuff like this. At this point I thought, oh, it would be pretty easy now to start kind of like generating art, because I've got all these light passes that I can create in 3D. I can create lighting passes, and then I can apply those lighting passes to brush strokes. But unfortunately, the realism of the CG that comes from the lighting and the organic nature of the kind of brush strokey art kind of clash. There's a clash going on here. So what I started to do is I started to break the CG. So this is before and this is after. And the more I broke it, the more I got away from that kind of mathematical CG lighting, the more I started to like it. I mean, this isn't great art by any stretch, but it's getting away from that kind of like cold mathematical precision was definitely helping. And these are some more examples of that, right? Adding the line work helped a lot, like we saw in that previous example of that, where that book talked about how important line work it was in artwork. And these are some more tests of doing that. So I felt like this stage I was kind of like very close with the medium, but my process wasn't kind of quite there. And by process, I mean that really annoyingly difficult stuff that artists do, that kind of like the artistic intention, style, composition. So I did what any kind of like art student with a fine arts training would do, and I decided to learn more about that process by doing a master copy, right? And a master copy is something that has a long tradition in art history, right? You take a piece of artwork that you really like, and by copying it, you figure out what it is that you like about that. It's like deconstructing an object and breaking it down into its component parts and then putting it back together. You can kind of figure out what it is that makes that thing, what it is you like about that. So I took this image, this is a real Monet, this is not mine unfortunately, and I decided, and I didn't do the people because they'd be too hard, but instead I started with a 3D model of the environment, so I just modeled it in a traditional way, and then I added my brush strokes, and then I colored it with color mixing, and then I got that. So that's pretty close, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if I flick between them, hold on, let me flick between them. You can see that I'm actually getting pretty close with that. And just to prove that this isn't some sort of like cheap kind of like comp gag, these brushstrokes do actually exist in 3D space, right? You can move a camera through it. So it's all kind of like, it's all correct in that way. And then I started playing around with other fun things like what would it look like if I made the painting just paint on? Stuff like this. So the problem I encountered with this is unfortunately it was very hand-tuned. Every color that I had to add here really reminded me how much the artist, in this case Monet, was making choices based on his artistic decisions, not based on kind of how the light looks. And that I decided that I wanted to take advantage of the fact that I was in 3D, and I wanted to do a lighting pass and just get that automatically. And I thought that would work, right? Surely that would work. Surely it would work to model this scene with really simple objects, put in the light, match the lighting, and then get this image. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because artists make these damn like artistic choices all the time that have nothing to do with reality. So for example, like that haystack on the left, I had to tilt that haystack down and rotate it from the top down for it to look like it was in the correct position. And that's just one dumb example. There were so many examples of how even Monet made decisions that were based on artistic intention, how important that artistic intention was. You can't just take the 3D and expect it to look like 2D. You have to have that artistic intention. So anyway, I persevered and I created my 3D scene. And this is the real Monet, and this is my one. This is not the render. This is just the actual brush strokes. And just so you can see that it is in 3D, just to show you, that's what it looks like, the brush strokes. And then that one is actually my one. So this is a white between them. So that's the real Monet, and this is my one. So you can see I'm actually pretty close. And the biggest lesson for me along this journey is the importance of artistic intention. How you can't take away the art, that kind of like human artistic decision-making process from creating art. And I think that was evident in Spiderverse, and it's definitely evident in my personal work. And it kind of reminded me of this really cool story of Diego Velázquez, who did that Pope painting that we saw before. And the story goes something like this. Diego was painting one of his beautiful paintings, and someone that was watching him said to him, the anatomy on that person's arm is incorrect. And Diego's response is perfect. And I think this really sums up the whole idea. And his response was, the anatomy might be incorrect, but the expression is right. And that's something that artists do. That can only come from artists. That ability to kind of know what that correct expression is, rather than just copying realism. So this leads us to our conclusion. I would say that based on all my work on personally and also on these films, my biggest conclusion is that artistic intention is central. And technology should facilitate artistic intention, right? We saw tons of examples of that on comp. We saw it in animation, the way the characters are animated. We saw it in drawing, in these drawings, the way we combined, like how important those handmade passes were in characters like Vulture. I think the real hero in this story is not technology, it's the human being. And when you place technology at the center, you simply don't get the best art, right? It also tends to make artists feel isolated and afraid, and we're seeing a lot of that with talk about AI right now. The best tools are the ones that help artists to become a better version of themselves. Let's level up the human skills, and by doing that, we're investing in each other and we're building community, and that benefits everyone. And that's the best use of technology I can think of. Okay, thank you.